don't know me, my name is Elise Severson, and I'm a first-year sophomore here at the University of Iowa. I'm currently studying for my BBA in economics, my BS in political science. I'm an honors student on the pre-law track, and I'm a research assistant here at the university. But outside of my academics, I also participate in undergraduate student government. I represent the University of Iowa to our local high schools through a program called Money Thing, and I'm in Hawk the Vote. But my largest time commitment by far this past year has been debate. If you don't know, the University of Iowa has a long and prestigious history of an excellent debate program, and this year is no exception. In fact, me and my partner, despite never having participated in college debate before, placed 17th in the nation, and Iowa is your 2025 cross-examination national debate champions. We ranked #1. We're actually lucky enough to have half of that partnership in here with us. This is Spencer. He came to watch me because he's great. But debate is a really awesome activity. And if you're like me, you probably don't know much about it. So let me give you a quick rundown. It's essentially a competitive research activity. We spend our weekends and our free time reading hundreds and probably thousands of articles, combing over data to find the best way to defend the topic. The topic this year is revolved around a resolution. The United States federal government should adopt a clean energy policy for decarbonization, including a market-based instrument. This meant we discussed things from subsidies to cap-and-trade systems to methane taxes and most commonly a carbon tax. In fact, this is the very topic my partner and I debated. We defended a carbon tax in the affirmative and worked to tear it down when we were the negative. So it's not often that we get to share this very unique sport and activity that we do with a community like this. So I am ecstatic and honored to stand in front of you today and present just a little bit about a carbon tax. But you've probably heard of it, but could it be good for more than just the environment? Well, first to start off, what is a carbon tax? At the most basic level, a carbon tax is a price on emissions. We put a price on the carbon that is being emitted. This naturally is going to cause reductions. In a debate round, we have to get a little bit more specific in that. This was the plan my partner and I defended. The United States federal government should adopt a clean energy policy for decarbonization, including a substantial and increasing price on carbon with a non-discriminatory border carbon adjustment. Sounds complicated, but it can be broken down into two parts. First, substantial and increasing price on carbon. This says the U.S. should adopt a carbon price that is significant enough to see shifts in the economy. Most research suggests somewhere in the ballpark of $45 to $50 to start. The increasing part is also important. We should increase this price on carbon by 5% over inflation year after year into infinity. This allows investors to see the direction the U.S. will be heading in climate policy. The second half of the statement, a non-discriminatory border carbon adjustment, BCA, or also called a CBAM, is simply when we apply that tax, the domestic tax, to foreignly imported goods. This is an important factor as for two reasons. One, it forces companies in other countries to place their own price on carbon to avoid having to pay the tax. And two, it stops local U.S. companies from moving abroad to other countries. It stops leakage, which means it's a key factor in having an effective carbon tax solution. Now, if you care about the environment, I probably don't have to do much talking to convince you that a carbon tax is a good idea. Yes, we need to do something to bring down our emissions, because if we continue on our current trend, it's not looking good. But if you look at the current state of our administration, they quite frankly just don't care. From pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement to rolling back EPA regulations, we've seen detrimental steps taken in the first 100 days of office. So the question becomes, how do we get people like them? How do we get Republicans, big corporations, and red voters from urban city centers to rural farm towns alike to vote for the idea of a carbon tax? The answer lies in something that shows up again and again on polls as the #1 thing people care about. We see it in the news almost daily: the economy. So how do we convince people that a carbon tax might be a good idea for the economy? Well, we first have to understand where we are right now. Studies show that, like it or not, the U.S. is poised on the edge of financial crisis. Now, this is not good, obviously. And according to Dr. Stiglitz, a Nobel Peace Prize winner in economics, this is because, despite Trump, the global transition to clean energy is inevitable. You might be thinking, isn't that a good thing? Don't we want the world to continue to promote green energy despite a lack of U.S. leadership? And to that, of course. But there's two sides to that coin. The world is moving in one direction while the U.S. is getting left behind. It creates a tension. As Trump parrots drill, baby drill, we see U.S. firms doubling down on things like oil and fossil fuels. This means U.S. companies are getting left behind. Independently, we see they are over-leveraged in physical markets. Companies are invested in things like real estate and infrastructure that will be affected by climate change, but they can't see it. In fact, a study found that physical and transitional risks are the two primary channels through which climate change is going to impact our financial markets. Investors and companies are over-allocated in their portfolios in items that are damaging by real impacts of climate change. Why is all this happening? Why can't we understand the direction the world is going and just head there? The real answer lies in uncertainty. The current state of US climate policy is uncertain. Investors don't understand the direction of the US. Are we going to get rid of all EPA regulations, or is my offshore drilling going to be approved? They just don't know. This leads to stalling. And in fact, studies show that if we continue on this current trend of climate policy uncertainty, we will see a decrease in jobs and lower GDP and reduced aggregate consumption from deferred investment decisions. This is simply because a climate policy uncertainty acts as a negative supply shock with both inflationary and recessionary impacts. This is bad, but how do we correct this trend? The answer is quite simple. It's a carbon tax. But how does a carbon tax reverse all these things? Well, it does it in a few key ways. First, a carbon tax creates certainty. If we have a policy in place, it is no longer ambiguous as to the climate future of the United States, especially when you add on that increasing 5% over year. Companies and investors understand that if they don't transition now, they're going to have to pay more in the future. This streamlines investments, and in addition, it also safeguards access to international markets. As we see places like the European Union and Canada start to hear more about how clean and carbon intensive these products are, it is important that we are on the right side of that coin. So a carbon tax can help ensure US competitiveness in markets abroad. Now, independently, we can also see that a carbon tax is shown to have profound effects on consumption and GDP growth. This is a very similar graph to the one I showed you earlier, but you see how it's going in the opposite direction? That is because a carbon tax provides that carbon-climate certainty. This directly and inversely changes the entirety of the system and is shown to increase aggregate production and actually increase labor participation force, which of course would create a growth in GDP and a growth in all those good things that we currently are not seeing. And as an added benefit, with this climate policy, we would see an increase in risk management. Companies can place a monetary price, and investors can understand the risk that they are holding. When we place a direct price on carbon, we allow them to manage the risk they hold. They can move away from those over-leveraged things in fossil fuels and infrastructure, because when your building falls into the ocean, you don't have that asset. Or when roads are torn down by hurricanes and derechos, you could have economic production stalled. But a carbon tax allows you to see that and better manage your portfolio risk. So to summarize, how do we get red voters to think a carbon tax is a good idea? The answer lies in the economy in 3 simple points. 1, a carbon tax provides certainty. A carbon tax sets the direction of US climate policy on a clear path. This means no matter how many regulations Trump rolls back or how much he says drill baby drill, we know that the US will have a substantial and increasing price on carbon that was going to drive investor decisions. 2, competition. A carbon tax creates and allows competition. The US can be leaders in green and clean energy instead of lagging behind and allowing other countries such as China to take the lead. And finally, risk management. A carbon tax allows and provides for risk management as companies and investors can see the monetary price of the risk that they hold. Thank you so much for letting me take 10 minutes of your time to share about a carbon tax. I love getting to talk about what I do on my weekends over the course of 2 hours, but trying to cram it in 10 minutes. If you ever have any questions about how a carbon tax would be good for the environment, or trade relations, or perhaps even developing economies, come talk to me. Or if you're curious about debate in general, I'd love to speak to you as well. Thank you.
Yeah, we're taking questions.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so everything you have is so research-based, and this is like a question I struggle with myself. I feel like a lot of times people on like the Republican side don't trust science,
Sure.
they don't trust like economics, and so how are we going to convince like people that already don't trust the actual science and economics, like tariffs generally, like at the level?
See, this is a joke that I like to say. So debate is very attuned to a lot of political situations, right? And so the big concern is that, okay, Trump's never going to do a carbon tax. And no, he's not. We've got like mechanisms and debate around that. But I'd say we're going to call it a carbon tariff. We don't want China's carbon. China's carbon's bad. It's a carbon tariff. Like, that's not really what it is. And so I think there's not a great way to get people to convince in science that they don't believe it, but sometimes the way you're wording and the way you approach subjects, right? Instead of approaching carbon tax as a good idea for the environment, we should approach it as something that's good for our trade relations because we can beat out China, and we do this through having this carbon price where we're going to tariff their carbon. And so you're using the same data, but you don't show them the data, you kind of dumb it down to the words that they like. And so, I mean, it's hard because you can't field test these things, right? In debate space, I mean, they're saying carbon tax is bad, I'm saying it's good, we're gonna have a 2-hour-long conversation about it. But, I mean, ultimately, it kind of boils down to the words you're using and, like, how much science you showed. So I showed a lot of graphs and, like, quoted people, and, like, I have a very long list of references as well, but, like, you wouldn't necessarily need to have all that. You just be like, well, we want to win, don't we? Like, China's got that AI stuff, like, we want to beat that, let's do a carbon tax.
As a debater, you had argued both sides equally.
I
So
do.
you argued against this idea just as much as you did. Correct?
That's a really fun thing about debate is, like, we like to say we're always on the side of truth. And so even though you do have to argue against it, I can still think it's independently a good idea. And I am the 2A, which means my primary goal is to build and construct the affirmative case, and I rely on my partner, Ben, to, like, do the negative stuff. So, like, I'm fully vested in the transition advantage of my carbon tax. But yes, I think the way we go about transitioning to full-scale renewables has some big pitfalls, right? We can see things like extraction, we can see the ways in which these renewables are created, and that really has the chance to be detrimental. But there are ways around that, right? I think solar fuels are a really great option. And so it is really unique to kind of see both sides and really get to have a conversation. But I'm the 2A, so, like, I love my carbon tax.
All right. I get that you love the carbon tax, but my primary question is, what is that greatest pitfall that you mentioned, and how do you defend the idea of still having a carbon tax against your opposition to extraction?
Do you have a pitfall you're thinking of? Because there's a lot of them. Which one?
You were the one who experienced them the most. If you can just
A lot of times what comes up is, like, is the U.S. federal government the best mechanism or the best actor to do this through? So you see other proposals like, should states have their own individual carbon taxes? We look to California. And the answer to that really lies in they can't do a BCA. And so BCA, that border carbon adjustment, is really key to the effectiveness of it but states can't do trade relations. Another one that we often commonly see, they're called critiques, and so they look at a more ethical side of whether or not you should, discuss something. So we see a lot of indigeneity arguments where, a carbon tax and then monetizing the price of something that is the earth is wrong and we shouldn't do it. And so that, that's a different type of conversation, but we would say, like, the communication of this information is just as important as the actualization of it. And so, yes, there are ways to go about this more ethically, but we also have to come from an understanding and a place that there is going to, unfortunately, kind of be some short straws, but working with those into groups and those people is really important as well. And so kind of having a defense of your rhetoric in the rounds, because some of those things are a little bit more like debate techy, you do it like in the round, but we would say that, like, a carbon tax would reduce emissions, which would be really, really great for a lot of minoritized populations because of things like air pollution. You'd have really heavy infrastructure, and you could look to some of these things. They are the communities most affected. And so carbon tax would help in that way. It's not necessarily the economy that you would, like, press them on, but you might look to, like, the warming advantage. Any other questions? Thank you. Oh, yeah.
Just kind of a follow-up from Ivan's point. So in entertaining conversation or debate across the aisle,
Yes.
what framing would you use to kind of leverage your own economic understanding for support of your carbon tax?
Sure. I think, honestly, if we look at the current state of why people voted, who they voted for, and kind of the rhetoric they respond to, it has to really be based around an enemy. I don't think that's necessarily the best way to do some of these conversations, but it is quite effective in mobilizing people. So I think a really great kind of enemy, quote unquote, to kind of point to is we can look to China. There's a lot of conversation about whether or not they kind of have a dominance on the supply chain market, whether or not they're going to kind of overtake us in things like solar and wind. And so having conversations with Republicans where you're like, hey, this foreign company is going to start having more influence in places like Latin America, they're going to start having more influence in Asia. These are things that kind of, they motivate people. And so having those conversations that, hey, if we do a domestic carbon tax, we can make China pay for carbon, we can involve our own investors, it's going to make sure that our farming is more sustainable, and when we have climate impacts, we won't have to turn to foreignly imported, fuel and reserves and things like that. And so I think the framing really has to be around, for better or for worse, kind of that enemy. And a lot of good places to look, unfortunately, it's not really true, is China. China is a good enemy to kind of point to because they are doing some of these things, but they also independently are building more coal farms. They see U.S. leadership is not there, and so they're not taking climate change as seriously, obviously, as everyone needs to be. And so to me, it really revolves around promoting that there are economic more than environmental benefits, and then like you kind of get like these, oh, it's an extra benefit, like we're gonna save the world, yay, but really driving home that like we're gonna increase jobs, we're going to, increase GDP, we're gonna talk about how you're gonna have better access to, your manufacturing job, because it's gonna be in windmills instead of in cars, and things like that. And we can even see kind of the popularization of the Tesla, right? Like the way that electric vehicles are kind of emerging, having more now, Teslas are not the greatest of inventions ever, and there's a lot of problems with the way the batteries are mined. These are all conversations that need to be had and are very important to discuss, but really the first step is getting people to discuss them. So if you focus on this idea that we can really increase the environment, stay ahead of China, have better global relations, and not let the European Union take advantage of us with their coming CBAM, some of this rhetoric is going to motivate some people who voted for the current administration.